Hey, MCI, I've been thinking about you a lot since Red Rock. I've been thinking about you a lot since this whole COVID-19 thing started. I've been thinking about you and I've been thinking about our Red Rock theme, where we invited each other to take off our masks and live in God's story. I've wondered if you've been wondering what it means to live in God's story right now, when what it means to just live seems really different right now. The truth is that so many of us are struggling to know what it means to live right now, right? And maybe you're wondering why. I mean, some of it's obvious, right? We can't go to school or hang out with our friends, but even on a deeper level, when we can feel in our bones and our souls, but can't always find words for, I think we're struggling to know how to live because the things we usually look forward to, which is just another way of saying the things we live towards, the things we usually feel like we live for, seem to be in jeopardy. Like this: grade 12s, how much of your year, how much of high school, how much of your life have you been living for graduation, for the accomplishment, sure, but for the ceremony and the party and every other part of the ritual that rightly celebrates this big rite of passage in your life? And yet, I don't know about you, but our grade 12 students here in Oregon just found out that they won't have any of their regular grad stuff. None of it. I don't know if that's the case for you. I hope it isn't or it won't be. But if it isn't the case, I bet you've at least started to wonder if it will become the case. And I bet you know in your heart of hearts that it's seeming increasingly possible, isn't it? Because right now, the things we usually live towards are in jeopardy. Just generally, the world is scary right now. In my church, one of the ways we've been talking about all this has been talking about ourselves as living in a time full of darkness. As in, right now, because we can't confidently see any of the things we usually look forward to ahead of us right now, it's like we're living in a thick darkness that makes it feel impossible to know how to move forward, to know what we should be even moving towards in life right now. We feel disoriented. We feel, as they say, lost in the darkness. But here's the thing: at Red Rock, we talked about how if you were hiding behind a mask, then you were just like Adam and Eve hiding in those bushes, which meant that you were right there at the beginning of God's story, which meant you were right where you needed to be to get to live in God's story. And guess what? If you feel like you're living in darkness right now, if you feel like you're lost in the darkness right now, if you don't know what to look for up ahead in order to know what you are moving towards right now, then guess what? You're at the beginning of the Easter story right now. You're ready to live in even that part of God's story. Here's what I mean. At the beginning of the Easter story in John, it doesn't immediately open onto a triumphantly resurrected Jesus striding back into his followers' lives. The story opens with Mary Magdalene coming to the tomb, and I'm quoting the text directly here, while it was still dark. And the story also tells us about the rest of the disciples who have holed up behind a locked door where they are cowering in fear, hiding behind closed doors, sometimes overcome with fear, looking for Jesus, but looking while it's still dark. The Easter story does not ask us to pretend that everything's okay right now, to practice a fake it till you make it faith. The Easter story begins in darkness. It begins in the way that many of us feel like we're beginning too many of our days right now. And the Easter story also begins with those who will one day become the church, holed up inside to keep themselves safe, just like all of us are. The Easter story begins with the disciples surely losing track of time, just like we are, because the Easter story begins with the disciples totally disoriented, just like we are so much of the time, because they've lost everything they had oriented their future towards. This teacher, this very Son of God, this Messiah, this one whose plan to save the world, heal the sick, lift up the poor, save the oppressed, this one who they had oriented their entire future towards, is dead. Everything they had oriented their entire future towards is dead. Let's not gloss over that or rush past it. But then the text says that suddenly Jesus is among them. On the other side of that door where they were hiding out behind, staying safe, Jesus is among them. Let that linger for a moment behind your closed door today, too. Jesus was among them. But admittedly, the text is racing now, and it's racing to say this immediately right afterwards because Jesus immediately says it, peace be with you. And we might be forgiven if we wonder if the disciples' first response, if our first response right now is a bit skeptical. Peace be with us? Peace be with us, Jesus? We imagine the disciples thinking, Jesus, do you realize what just happened out there? Do you realize that every single thing we achieved, every single thing you promised about saving the sick and the poor and the oppressed, about being the Messiah and our Savior, that all of it, that none of it can possibly be true? That it can't possibly be true because you died, Jesus? I suspect that many of us can imagine the disciples thinking those things because we can feel similarly skeptical about our future right now too, can't we? I mean, things are so bad in so many places in the world right now. Here in the States, for example, people are dying and their loved ones can't even visit them. And Jesus, in the midst of all this, is just saying, peace be with you. And then Jesus holds out his hands to the disciples and shows them his wounds. And it's like this. With this, Jesus is saying, well, if these are really my hands, if these are really my wounds, if I'm really resurrected from the dead, which means that I've conquered death, if I'm really here among you and have really conquered all the death and darkness, then yeah, peace be with you. Because here's the thing, friends, if Jesus is here showing us his wounds, if Jesus has been resurrected, if Jesus has conquered death and darkness, well, then our outlook is a little different, isn't it? If Jesus has conquered death and darkness, then nothing, not even this virus, not even everything that seems wrong in this world, none of it gets the last word because Jesus gets the last word over all of it. Because beyond what we can always see or understand in this broken world, ultimately, in the end, Jesus gets the last word. That, my friends, is what the Easter story offers us today. Today, amidst all this disorientation, when we no longer know what we're even living towards, while we're huddled behind closed doors, the Easter story, the resurrected Jesus reaches out to us and says, this truth is what you're living towards. When everything else is failing you and you no longer have any idea what you are living towards, let love and life and confidence in the future turning out right, even when the signs aren't pointing that way, let that be the light at the other end of the dark tunnel, the light that you live towards. Let the light shining from the resurrected Jesus be the marker ahead that you live towards, even when, especially when, everything else around you is darkness. So what does this mean? Let me tell you a story. You know, according to John Curt, a writer for the blog Grace and Truth, in 1665, there was actually a village named Eyam that became infected with bubonic plague. Many started dying, and the natural inclination for those who weren't dying, of course, was to flee. But their vicar, their reverend, knew that if the plague traveled beyond their village, the results would be catastrophic for so many, many more. As Curt tells it, knowing this, the vicar gathered the whole village together and made an appeal to everyone to quarantine themselves. He told his parishioners that to avoid many more people dying beyond the village itself must be enclosed with no one allowed in or out. He proposed this, that none of them would leave no matter what. And incredibly, the people of the village agreed, and they kept their commitments, even as the immediate consequences they faced became brutal. Within 6 months, the disease was taking 5 or 6 lives per day. One woman lost 6 of her children and her husband in just 8 days. The vicar lost his own life. It's estimated that up to 50% of the town died. And yet, because the villagers held true to their commitment not to leave, the plague did not breach their borders. The plague was successfully contained. Some powers that be, my friends, might try to tell you that that's a story about death and darkness winning. But we who know the Easter story, we know that this is actually the story of people who knew the truth of Easter. It's a story of those who knew, even when the world around them became pitch black, that if they looked for it, there was a light ahead. A light ahead that was the resurrected Christ saying, whatever happens now, life and light still win. I still win. This, my friends, is the story of a village that looked darkness right in the eye and then looked beyond it to Jesus Christ and said, since Jesus died and rose again, since Jesus conquered death and darkness, we will, even in the darkest darkness, orient ourselves towards that light and live towards that future. Friends, I can't promise you that you'll have a grad or a bunch of other things you're looking forward to this year. But I can promise you this. Whatever it is you're grieving, stare that darkness down. Stare right through it until you can look a little beyond it and look for the light. Look for the proof that even death can't have the last words, because you can live towards that. You can live in God's story. You can keep moving towards that.